You can start and we are live.
Okay, great. Good day, everybody. Welcome, Sambonane, good evening. Well, it's nearly evening in Johannesburg, where we are speaking to you from. We have Professor Ran Greenstein with us, who is the guest tonight of Africa for Palestine. Africa for Palestine is a Johannesburg-based South African organization working on conscientizing, awareness raising around the question of Palestinian rights and against the occupation. It is one of a number of such organizations in South Africa and around the world. Today with us we have Professor Ran Greenstein, and Professor Ran Greenstein is a professor in sociology from the University of Witwatersrand. I know it sounds like a complicated name, but it is one of South Africa's more famous university. He studied at the University of Haifa in Israel, Palestine, and at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Professor Greenstein is the author of a number of works, including Genealogies of Conflict, Class, Identity, and State in Palestine, Israel, and South Africa. And he's also the author of Comparative Perspectives on South Africa, Radical Dissent in Israel, the Independent Left. It's a manuscript wherein he examines the left in Israel between 1967 and 1993. So Professor Greenstein will be speaking to us today, and he is speaking to us on the question of Israeli Jewish critical perspectives. He'll be talking for about 20 or 25 minutes, and then we'll take questions, and people can post their questions on Facebook as well. So over to you, Ran. Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Professor Farid Esak, and thanks Africa for Palestine for inviting me to give this presentation. What I want to do here is to offer a historical perspective on the critical voices from within Israeli Jewish society over the last century or so, but with a focus, of course, on current developments. But in order to understand the current developments, we need a bit of historical background. So let me start with this by saying that historically, there have been two forms of dissent from the mainstream Zionist policies among Jews living in Israel, Palestine. There's been a liberal humanist critique and a left-wing opposition. Before 1948, when Palestine was still a unified political entity, in which a Jewish nationalist settlement movement, that is Zionism, operated to extend Jewish presence both physically and politically in the country at the expense of the local Arab population, its ultimate goal was to transform the country into a Jewish state, Jewish both in its composition, meaning Jews would become the majority of the population, and in its cultural, institutional, political orientation. Critical voices challenged Zionism from within the Jewish community. They were always a minority. They were never in a position of majority for a simple reason. It was an immigrant settler society, and most people who lived there within the Jewish community were recent immigrants. That is to say, they moved into the country as a result of a conscious political choice or as a result of economic and social circumstances, but these circumstances prevented them or made it difficult for them to challenge the mainstream political orientation, because they were there precisely because of that political orientation. The liberal trend of dissent opted for what they call a bi-nationalist alternative to mainstream Zionism. They called for the sharing of political power between Jews and Arabs, both groups seen as ethno-national collectives, regardless of their demographic weight in the population. I'm talking now about the early period of the British Mandate from the end of the First World War until 1948. Jews, of course, were a minority in that period, but the call for binationalism or a binational state said that Jews and Arabs are there as two constituent communities, essential element of the population, and it doesn't matter whether they are a majority or a minority, they have to share the country between them. And that was a deviation, a very important deviation from the Zionist imperative of establishing a Jewish state. They called for a binational state, not for an exclusive Jewish state. A series of groups advocated this position during the period of British rule, but it was always a minority position with some support from intellectuals and academics, but hardly from broader mass constituencies. Their orientation also became known as spiritual Zionism because they supported some elements of the Zionist program, especially immigration and settlement, but not the goal of acquiring sole political power and establishing a Jewish state. And they were willing also to compromise on some elements of the immigration and settlement aspects of Zionism, committing themselves to supporting the growth of the Jewish community up to the point where it reaches 50% of the population, but without becoming the majority. Now, the extent to which such issues of immigration and settlement would be subject to majority rule if Palestine became independent differed among advocates of binationalism. Some of them agreed to restrictions that would prevent Jews from becoming a majority, while others rejected any limitations, but continued to insist that Jewish immigration and settlement must not come at the expense of local Palestinian or local Palestinian Arabs through expropriation or forced removal or any acts of dispossession. They believe that you can have a massive wave of Jewish immigration, settlement on the land, but without necessarily resulting in dispossession of Palestinians. The left-wing opposition at the same time of the British rule was organizing the Palestinian Communist Party, which, despite its name, was predominantly Jewish in composition. We have to remember that the name, the adjective Palestinian referred to the country as a whole rather than to a specific ethnic or national group within it. So there was no contradiction in a Palestinian Communist Party being composed, at least initially, predominantly from Jewish members. In the 1920s and 30s, though, the party faced constant pressure from the Communist International with which it was affiliated to recruit Arab members and establish roots among the indigenous workers and peasants rather than remain solely based among Jewish immigrants. This led to a change in composition from the mid-1930s onwards, but also to a movement of Jewish activists away from the party and towards Zionist position in reaction to the campaign that became known as Arabization. And South African would know that a similar campaign was launched by the Communist International in relation to the South African Communist Party, which faced similar issues of being predominantly a party of white workers, at least initially in the 1920s, in the same period, 1920s and 30s. As a result of this pressure, the party frequently split on national basis, forming different factions and sometimes completely different organizations based on national identity or ethnic identity, with Jewish and Arabs members belonging to different organizations. But for most of that period, the different factions formally adhered to the same goals of the Palestinian Arab national movement: an end to Jewish immigration and land transfers, and formation of a national democratic government that would give power to the majority of the population without qualifications. But in the 1940s, the Soviet leadership started changing its orientation and started recognizing the Jewish population in Palestine as a national minority, and eventually moved towards a bi-nationalist perspective, and in a further move in the late 1940s, started supporting the partition of the country between the two national groups, Jews and Arabs. 1948 was a crucial turning point, of course, with the creation of Israel and destruction of Palestinian society, which became fragmented between areas that fell under Israeli rule, territories that were controlled by Jordanian and Egyptian forces, what became known as the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, and at least half of the population became refugees dispersed in various parts of historical Palestine and neighboring countries. Almost without exception, political forces in the new state of Israel started operating on the new terrain created in 1948. From a Palestinian perspective, the biggest issue that was created by 1948 was the Nakba, the consequences of the defeat and dispersal of 1948, of the war. But from an Israeli perspective, the issue was restricted to the consequences of the Nakba internally within the new state. The 15% of the population who were Arabs and Palestinian in origin, who remained in their homes and communities for the most part, and became Israeli citizens. Many of them were subjected to military rule by the new state of Israel, as they lived in regions that had been allocated to the Arab state by the 1947 UN partition resolution. They experienced massive land expropriation and various restrictions on their ability to move freely, study, engage in professional and commercial activities. The main concerns of liberal and left forces, Israeli liberal and left forces within that context, was the struggle to remove military rule and related restrictions and grant equal rights to Palestinian citizens. Military government was abolished indeed in 1966, but the struggle over issues of land in particular continued and culminated in the massive mobilization of the Day of the Land of March 1976. The Communist Party, the Israeli Communist Party at that time, which was constructed out of the original Palestinian Communist Party, together with remnants of a Palestinian Arab leftist organization called the National Liberation League, which operated primarily in Haifa and Nazareth in the 1940s, was the main political force fighting for equality during that period. And it gradually gained the support of majority of Palestinians with Israeli citizenship, especially after forming the Democratic Front for Peace and Equality in 1977, which was nominally a Jewish Arab front, but effectively was led by Palestinian activists and voters. Liberal Jewish forces operated at that period on the margins of the mainstream Labour Party, which was also the ruling party until 1977. They generally supported equal rights for all citizens, but they never supported either the right of return of refugees, the 1948 refugees, or any change to the Jewish nature of the state of Israel. And in that sense, they were different from the Communist Party and other Palestinian forces for whom the rights of refugees and the Jewish nature of Israel were ongoing concerns. For the Jewish left or liberal left, these were sort of historical questions, and the focus was on post-1948 Israel. But then something major changed. The abolition of military government in 1966 was followed only a few months later by the introduction of a crucial element in the political evolution of Israeli-Palestinian relations. And that was, of course, the 1967 war and occupation of all of historical Palestine, the West Bank and Gaza, as well as other Syrian and Egyptian territories. From then on, the question of the occupied territories became the most important dividing line in Israeli politics. Alongside the Communist Party, which opposed the 1967 war and the occupation, two predominantly Jewish movements were prominent in the struggle against the occupation. The first one, a very small movement by the name of Matzpen, which in Hebrew means compass, was a small radical leftist organization composed of Israeli Jews, a few Palestinians who had left the Communist Party and moved left, and some immigrant Jewish youth from Latin America and France in particular, who were radicalized by the global resurgence of the new left in the 1960s. This movement was heavily theoretical in orientation and later on split into many different factions on the basis of differences that remained obscure for most of their supporters and potential recruits. The other movement was called SIAH, which is an acronym for New Israeli Left. And it was formed by young dissidents of the historical Zionist left and other activists. And it was not explicitly anti-Zionist as Matzpen was. It focused on direct action, protest, educational activities, rather than theory and programs as Matzpen did. And because of its more direct action orientation, it was more appealing to young students at high schools and universities. But its criticism of Israeli policies was less thorough and less oriented towards global issues, and less radical, of course. By the 1970s, SIAH moved to engage in parliamentary politics and started forming alliances with liberal Zionists. And one of its later day manifestation or incarnation is the current movement of Meretz, which is considered to be the epitome of liberal Zionism or left-wing Zionism within Israeli politics. This group of people are generally critical of the occupation and informal discrimination against Palestinian citizens, but they remain Zionists, essentially, in that they support Israel as a Jewish state, and they oppose the right of return of Palestinian refugees from 1948. In fact, and that may seem bizarre to outsiders, many of them say that they are critical of the occupation precisely because they are Zionists, not despite their Zionism. How to explain that? Zionism for them means a return to pre-1967 Israel, when the Jewish majority was unchallenged and the cause of Jewish nationalism as expressed in the State of Israel was supported by many around the world as a redress for the historical suffering of the Jewish people, especially in the Holocaust. Of course, the Palestinian cause and the Palestinian struggle during that period was largely absent, not just from Israeli consciousness, but from global consciousness. And it only made its re-emergence in the 1960s with the formation of the PLO, the PFLP, Fatah, and various other movements. But for those liberal Zionists in Meretz and other movements, that was the golden period of Israel to which they wish to return in the name of this pure, innocent, liberal, progressive Zionism. They are also secular in orientation and are disgusted by the combination of rabid nationalism with religious messianism as represented by the post-1967 settler movement in particular. We refer to them popularly as the Zionist left, but in fact they are liberals who do not pursue any left-wing agenda in the normal sense of the term and are regarded as elitist by their right-wing Jewish rivals. If you want to have maybe a pertinent analogy to this group of people, it's a bit like the resistance to Trump by liberal East Coast, West Coast elites in the US, who are generally white, educated, middle and upper class people, who have very limited base among the broad masses of white working class in the US. In a similar way, these liberal or left-wing Zionists have limited bases among the majority of Jewish Israelis of poor background, the Jewish working class and lower middle class, which is composed mostly of Mizrahim, that is Jews whose origins are in the Middle East and North Africa, and Russian and Ethiopian immigrants. How this so-called left is rejected by the bulk of the poor segments of the population, the Jewish population, and what is the role of intra-Jewish ethnic division in that is an important issue in its own right. I'm just mentioning it here now, but it requires further discussion. The electoral fortunes of these Jewish liberal forces have declined steadily over the years, and by now have been reduced to no more than 3 or 4 members in parliament out of 120. But we have to remember, in 2015, only 5 years ago, they were supported by the elections in that year by about 1 million voters. So there is a potential constituency here for some limited change, at least, of course, not for radical change. In any event, I mentioned Matzpen and Siach as small but radical movements that campaigned against the occupation. By the 1980s, the mode of operation of parties or more consolidated organization was no longer attractive to activists. And there was a flurry of ad hoc single issue movements that replaced them. For example, Committee of Solidarity with Birzeit University when it was faced particularly intensive repression by the Israeli military in the occupied territories, the Committee Against the War in Lebanon in 1982, Breaking the Silence, a group of enlisted soldiers who act as whistleblowers against atrocities committed by occupation soldiers, the Committee Against Housing Demolition, and so on. Many different movements, but they are not a single organization. They don't have an overall platform or party. They focus on specific tasks and specialize in their unique niche area. Of course, all these different causes are related, but they don't aim to form a party or a mini party in the way that activists in the 1960s and 70s tried to do. And again, this is something familiar, I think, for those who are familiar with the history of the South African left that went through similar processes. These organizations or movements or NGOs usually challenge the regime in its most oppressive practical aspects, but they do not necessarily challenge the ideological foundation of its policies. There are more radical voices that offer a complete critique of Zionism, not just the 1967 occupation, but the 1948 Nakba and its consequences and the structure of Israel as a Jewish state. But these voices are very small minority among Israeli Jews. For example, I'll mention just one movement called the One Democratic State Campaign that does have an overall anti-Zionist program, calls for a liberated Palestine where Jews and Arabs will be equal, but it consists of a small number of intellectual and activists with no mass basis, and their existence is almost entirely online with not really in any substantive sense on the ground. In the last 5 years, with the creation of the Joint List, which is a coalition of Palestinian organizations within Israeli society, all of them are Israeli citizens, many of these Jewish radical voices see the Joint List as the only alternative to mainstream Zionist politics, because it's the only consistent non-Zionist voice, and it's led by Palestinians, not by Jews. These are the two major elements distinguishing the Joint List from the Zionist left. First, it's Palestinian-led movement, and secondly, they don't support Zionism. They are not necessarily actively against Zionism as an ideology, but they are definitely not in favor of it. They prefer to keep it to the sideline and not to engage with it directly. But it's estimated the Jews contributed in the last series of elections that we had in the beginning of this year and twice last year. Jews contributed between 1/2 to 1 seat in parliament out of 15 of the Joint List total. So it's about 5% of the votes of the Joint List come from Jewish citizens and the 95% from Palestinian citizens. So obviously Jews are a small minority within this structure. What is the role of critical Jews in that structure? There are different positions within the Joint List, but one element in particular, and that is the element represented by the Communist Party and the Democratic Front for Peace and Equality, which is the biggest component in this coalition known as the Joint List. They are in favor of incorporating more Jews. There are other forces within the Joint List who adopt a more Arab nationalist and even Islamic perspective, and they are less welcoming to Jewish activists. Debate about a new Jewish Arab movement take place among the Zionist left because of its consistent failure to gain ground and consistent loss of support to centrist mainstream Zionist forces. But it's not clear that they can succeed. The Joint List is not just a party, not just a coalition of parties, but it's also a representative structure of the entire Palestinian Arab community of citizens. So while they would welcome the support of individual Jews, many elements within it would worry that it would dilute this nationally representative nature of the Joint List, and it's a topic of ongoing debate. Among the Jewish Zionist left, Meretz in particular, there's also reluctance to join or to form an alliance with the Joint List. And just this week, or last week, the end of last week, a survey of Meretz members showed that only about 1% of them would definitely support a new Jewish Arab formation. That is to say, dismantling Meretz and forming a coalition with the Joint List. And maybe 20% of them would consider voting for such a list. But the rest of the 80% of the membership of Meretz, the most radical of Jewish Zionist forces, would refuse to support an alliance with the Joint List. So that tells us there is a very serious problem here. It remains a topic to consider for further debate. Finally, I want to end on a series of questions for us to consider, and that come up from the history of this movement, and its limitation. The first question is, how do we deal with the notion of Zionism? Do we look at it as a complete ideology that we adopt or reject as a whole, or a set of discrete practices that we can address separately, each on its own, and mobilize whoever is willing to work on that particular issue? For example, the 1967 occupation. Many people who define themselves as Zionists are willing to fight against the occupation in their own way. Are they legitimate partners? What do we do with them? Or do we refuse to have anything to do with them until they renounce Zionism as a whole? Okay, that's a question. What is the nature of the struggle? That's a question posed more for Palestinian activists, not Jewish activists, but of course it's of concern to all of us. Is the struggle essentially a national liberation struggle, or is it a struggle for equality of rights within a unified political structure that you may call Israel or Palestine or Israel-Palestine? What is the specific national component, Palestinian Arab national component within this overall struggle? Again, it's a topic for debate. I'm not offering any answers to that. I'm just saying these are questions that need to be considered. And finally, with direct reference to the notion of BDS and the host movement of this seminar, Africa for Palestine, how do we deal with the three core demands of the BDS movement? The termination of the 1967 occupation, equality of rights to Palestinian citizens of Israel, and recognition and support for the right of return of the 1948 Palestinian refugees. Are these demands interlinked to be seen as one unified programs? Do we organize separately on each one of them because they have different bases of support? People who support all three demands are relatively a minority, definitely within Israel. People who support one of two of these demands are more numerous. How do you deal with this kind of situation? Not just specifically with regard to potential Jewish supporters, but in general, it's a question that needs to be considered in this context, precisely because two of these demands may generate a modest but significant level of support among Israeli Jewish liberals and leftists. That is the fight against the 1967 occupation and equality of rights for Palestinian citizens. But the demand for recognition and support for the right of return of the 1948 refugees enjoys very little support among this constituency. How do you deal with this kind of situation is an ongoing issue for debate and mobilization. Let me end on this point and hand over to Professor Esak.
Thank you very much, Ran, for that. Yeah, let me start off, Ran, by by raising the question of Jewish resistance leaders. In South Africa, one of the major elements, to my mind, that prevented our struggle for liberation from becoming a long, drawn-out, dirty racial war was the active presence of many white people, not just many whites in terms of numbers, but also in terms of the positions that they occupied inside the liberation movement broadly, and that's especially in the Congress kind of tradition. That's inside the African National Congress, the trade unions, and the United Democratic Front. In fact, I don't know if you know, it's just kind of very anecdotal, but I was recently having reason to think about an organization that I headed at that time. It was perhaps the most consequential Muslim organization inside the liberation struggle. And one of the founders of this movement was actually a South African Jew, Jeremy Cronin. Jeremy Cronin was one of the key people behind the scenes that helped in the formation, before the public formation even of this entity. So ranging from your Jeremy Cronins to your Beyers Nodis to your Bram Fishers and so on. Now, inside Israel, of course, you know, you have names occasionally that come up. And of which perhaps arguably the most famous is Amira Haas, you know. But why do you think, and of course, I mean, when you look at what is this, the anti-conscription movement amongst the young Israelis?
Yesh Gvul. Yesh Gvul.
Yesh Gvul.
Yeah.
They've been active, they get kind of detained and so on, but you don't have anybody serving long jail sentences. You don't have your Marian Sparks being tortured in prison. So I'm just curious about, at least at a public perception, the absence of this phenomenon that was very strong in South Africa, the absence amongst Jewish Israelis. How do you, what do you, what
well, look, first, I mean, at the level of individuals, you do have some names. For example, I mean, this is like going back a long time, but Uri Davis was a draft resistor,
yes, of course, yes,
and he continues to be activist. But the thing is, the difference, most of the names that you mentioned, like Bram Fisher and Jeremy Cronin, and we can add Ronnie Casrels and Joe Slova and so on, they were members of a mass movement, of course. They were members of the Communist Party. And the Communist Party had the long alliance with the ANC from the 1950s at least. And so there is a long tradition of this operation. But in addition to that, they didn't operate as individuals of good conscience. They were members of the movement. But I think, I can't speak for them, of course, but I think from what I know, let's take someone like Bram Fisher, for example. He saw himself as a South African who fights for all South Africans. He didn't see himself as an Afrikaner fighting for Black people. Of course, Black people were the majority of the population. They were the moral core of the struggle because they were the most oppressed element in the population. But the struggle was a South African struggle against capitalism, against colonialism, against British rule initially, against apartheid. And so there was a sense of a unified South African identity that transcended the racial divisions, because the struggle was not defined in racial terms or nationalist terms, or rather in nationalist terms, but the nation is the South African nation as a whole. It's not a specific group within South African society. So these were not do-gooder whites helping Black people. They regarded themselves as an essential element of the struggle. Of course, they recognized the leadership role of Black leadership, of the ANC and so on, but they were part of that struggle. Now, this sense of an overall national consciousness that incorporates both Jews and Arabs doesn't exist. And I think the reason it does not exist is because both Zionism and Palestinian Arab nationalism, from their inception in the late 19th century, the early part of the 20th century, were constituted as nationalist movements that speak to a specific ethnic or national group with some religious undertone. They were not religious movements, but it's difficult to separate religion from nationalism in that context, definitely for Jews, but also for the Palestinian Arab national movement was defined as a Muslim Christian movement. So it had this also religious undertones. And there was never on offer this kind of joint consciousness. Even the people, the liberal critics that I mentioned in the beginning, the binationalists, they regarded the situation as composed of two groups. That's the essence of binationalism, two national groups. They share power, but they retain the boundaries between them, culturally, educationally, and politically to a large extent. So this absence of common national consciousness is a central obstacle to the formation of this kind of politics that transcends racial or national boundaries and allow individual Jewish activists to take up a unified cause and to run with it. Having said all that, I must add, there are many individuals who operate quite courageously, especially young people. We don't know them because they are not great intellectuals or theorists. They are young, they are active, their activism is very welcome, like the draft resistors, for example. We don't know many of them because their contribution is not theoretical or political in nature. It's the example they provide for an alternative perspective. Now, I must add one major change that I see in the way I look at it from the 1970s, let's say, when I was at that age, to today, is that there's much greater willingness among these young activists to accept Palestinian leadership of the kind provided by the Joint List than there was the case in the 1970s. In the 1970s, you had your own left-wing organization that may have entered a coalition with the Communist Party, for example, in the Democratic Front for Peace and Equality. But now, and the Democratic Front was not a Palestinian formation as such. In terms of its self-definition, it was a Jewish Arab movement. Now there is much more explicit recognition of the leading role of Palestinian activists, intellectuals in that struggle. It's still on the margins. I mean, the Jews, the Jewish activists and intellectuals who accept the leading role of Palestinians are still, of course, a small minority, but they do it explicitly. And that, I think, is some progress compared to the previous decades. But you're right, we don't have this type of prominent individuals. There are members of the Communist Party representing it in parliament. This is one of the controversial aspects of the Joint List. They insist on having at least one Jewish representative among them, provided by the, normally by the Communist Party or its electoral front. There was Dov Khanin in the previous parliaments, Tamar Gozhansky before him. Now there's Ofer Kasif. They are activists that earn their role, not just because they are sort of symbolic Jews, you know, who come to provide some decoration. They are experienced activists and they earn their place. But of course, they are a tiny minority and they are not accepted by the broad Jewish population as legitimate Jewish forces. So they say, well, okay, there is a Jewish guy, but he goes with the Arabs, so he's nothing to do with us. So we have still a long way to go.
Ran, to what do you attribute the intensity of tribalism? I mean, because this is basically, this is one way of describing what Zionism is. But in response to that, you can also speak about Arab nationalism as a form of tribalism, okay? But for now, it seems as if pre-48, there was a greater sense amongst the Jews of their own Palestinian identity. There was a group identity as Jews, as you would find Jews in South Africa, or communities that are, for example, in some parts of in the Western Cape, in Boerkaap, you find a large geographical area that is about 98% Muslim, okay? But they live their Muslimness out as part of being Cape Townians, and as being part of being Cape Townians, they are South Africans, and all these identities live happily alongside each other, and there is never a clash between these different forms of identities. So before 48, many of these Jewish communities, they lived in such harmony that they were also Palestinians, in the same way that the Jews from Morocco or the Jews from Yemen were also Yemenis or Iraqis, and many of them, they still carry the Iraqiness with them, even inside Israeli society, or their Moroccanness with them. And so, was it entirely an engineered thing that the organic nature of these communities became so intensely ideologized in the service of this new nation state, but also in some ways, given where the idea was conceived and the class levels of people involved in the conception, and so the European influence is very, very strong, and along with it comes, just historically, comes the whole colonial element. So at what point does this colonial element, with all its disdain for the indigenous, and this disdain, by the way, wasn't just for the indigenous Palestinians. Many of the Zionist elites had disdain for the victims of the Holocaust because they were weak. They were weak, they were too fallible, they didn't have the guts to fight, So it wasn't just a contempt for the indigenous non-Jew, but it was also an indigenous contempt for the indigenous Jew. And this, of course, contempt continues inside Israel. If you see the contempt that there is for the Mizrahi Jews, and that kind of tensions in Israeli society. But at what point does this ideological fusion into tribalism really become strengthened and triumph, to the extent that the vast majority of citizens at the moment cannot conceive of even a separate state, let alone we are really all one. We were once a part of each other. At what point did this kind of thing just kind of completely imprison Israeli society?
Well, it's a gradual process, and education, of course, plays a major role, and state efforts to strengthen the Jewish nationalist component and to block off any alternatives. That's been a consistent feature of the Israeli Jewish educational system from its beginning, from 1948. It's also been strengthened by the kind of constant immigration into Israel, waves of immigration over the years, that some of them were by people who felt they were discriminated against and marginalized in their own countries of origins. And now they want to feel that they are a secure majority in their new home. And there's been an ongoing process of immigration sustaining this consciousness. In recent years, you had especially the Russians, the Ethiopians, who don't, even though they are marginalized themselves, they don't show any sense of solidarity with other marginalized communities, but they can share in Israeli Jewish nationalism as an ideology, and not just ideology, a set of practices that welcomes them, not just as equal citizens, but as superior type of citizens. So there is ongoing ideological work being done and very consciously so, by the education system, by public media, by the military that plays a major role in socializing people into Israeli society. And so that's obviously one important element. Now we have to consider also critically, what is the role of Palestinians and Arabs in general in all that? Now, in a sense, the task of Israeli ideology or propaganda, if you want to use that term, telling local Jews, you are hated, you are discriminated against, you have been marginalized. The only place where you feel secure is Israel. Everywhere else is dangerous. And if it's not dangerous now, it can become dangerous later on. The success of this ideological manipulation relies also on their ability to choose examples. Maybe it's cherry picking, but it's real examples of Palestinian movements and individuals who do express themselves in a way that is hostile to Jews, not just to Israel and to its activities, but to Jews in general. Now you can say these are a minority, they are not representatives, but they exist. And they cause incredible damage. From Haj Amin al-Husseini in the 1940s, who spent the war years with the Nazis in Germany, to Ahmed Shukeri and his famous quote that is disputed, but regardless of whether it was precise or not, talking about throwing the Jews into the sea, and to Hamas and its Islamic ideology. Now you can say they've been misinterpreted, their words were taken out of context, which is true. And even with Hamas, within Hamas, there are many different voices. And there are voices of reason and reconciliation, not compromise, but acceptance of Jews as equal citizens and so on. But it's easy for the propaganda machinery to use, even if it's dissident examples, and to blow them out of proportion and to use them as the epitome, not just of Palestinian or Arab or Islamic hostility to Jews, but, and that's the power of this ideology, to link it to a trans-historical, trans-geographic force called anti-Semitism. And within this ideology, we have to understand it. Anti-Semitism, this debate about it, but the popular understanding, not the academic understanding, the popular understanding is that it's a force that starts with the pharaohs of Egypt 4,000 years ago, the Persians, in the first millennium BC, goes all the way through Christianity, all the way to the present. It's this kind of force that all the tiniest incidents that occur, that are not organized, they have nothing to do with Palestinian. Someone draws a swastika on some Jewish tombstone in Germany or France or wherever, it's not seen as an isolated incident. It's immediately incorporated into this trans-historical, thousands of years long history. And it's very easy to accept it because you are indoctrinated in this way. Now, there's a Jewish American academic, I forgot his name right now, but he wrote a few weeks ago, he wrote an article saying we should stop using the title anti-Semitism. We can talk about anti-Jewish incidents. They happen all the time in many different places. But to link them together to this kind of force that exists outside of history called anti-Semitism, it's all chains in one, all links in one continuous chain, is misleading historically. It's not to minimize real incidents of hostility toward Jews, but they are part of their own local context. We have to analyze them within their specific context. If we talk about anti-Semitism about anti-Jewish incidents in 18th century Persia, for example, we have to link it to the hostility of the Shia clergy against other Muslims, Sunni Muslims. I mean, it's not something isolated. But in the way it's interpreted in Israel, and it's very consciously interpreted in that way and disseminated, it's part of this long chain that exists forever. And the only way to overcome it is by being strong. If we are not strong, we will be exterminated. And of course, there are real examples of extermination. It's not completely fabricated, but it's a misreading of history that you cannot really fight except by developing alternative histories. I mean, not making something fabricated in the sense of inventing, using proper historical research. Like in South Africa, we had the revisionist radical historians. They created a different image of historical events based on evidence, based on the archives, based on people's oral history. And something similar to that happens in Israel as well, but it's restricted to small groups of intellectuals, academics. It doesn't have this broader purchase on society as a whole. It's an ongoing, task. It's not going to happen overnight, but that's the direction we need to go.
Ran, in an earlier comment of mine, I spoke about, the intensity of tribalism. And one of the comments on Facebook referred to the British case of 4 nations inside one country. And so that's interesting, but it also alerted me to the fact that in my whole talking about Arab nationalism with this, with an ideologized Jewish tribalism, I could easily have spoken about tribalism as a peculiarly Middle Eastern or a global South or a black kind of phenomenon. And so the UK is one example, and many other parts of the world, I mean, even the United States and so on. But I want to ask you one last question, Ran. In thinking about a possible solution forward, one of the ideas that was always at the back of our minds in South Africa, we have to live with each other. There was never a death wish for any of the South African communities. We sang songs, yes, that the Boers are dogs. We sang these songs, but we sang these songs when white people were in the audience and they sang with us. They never thought or imagined that we're referring to them. So even when there was these slogans of kill the Boer, or one settler, one bullet, people never actually imagined that. And I'm talking now as an activist, okay? There was always a sense that, at the end of the day, we have to find each other. But the problem with Zionism is that no such sense can ever be created, because this is a state that is intended to unsettle its demography continuously by bringing in more people from the outside. So the most right-wing South African Jews, they go to Israel to go and settle there. A certain type of person that refuses to live with his or her neighbors in Brooklyn or those types. And of course you have the economic refugees from Russia and other countries as well, fine. So, but the problem is when your population is being destabilized in this way by a continuous call to come. I mean, if apartheid was premised on the idea that this country was a home for all right-wing whites the kind of alt-right that you see emerging in Europe at the moment. And if those whites actually came to South Africa, there was no ways that ordinary whites would have come to terms with the fact that they have to reach an agreement with Black South Africans. But this is at the heart of Zionism, that we have to collect all of those other whites from other parts of the world. And even if we appeal to the most right-wing ones among them and bring them into South Africa. And so this destroys any possibility for an organic coming to, recognize the humanness of your neighbor, or, falling in love with, So,
well, no.
It's a non-negotiable entity, I think.
Yeah, at the level of official ideology, yes. And the level of the immigration practice that recreates this kind of sense of tribalism, absolutely true. But let me give two examples that are more positive in nature, not because I want to present an artificially rosy picture, just to point out some different dynamics as well. One of them has to do with the medical field. For some reason, I am not really familiar with the precise sociology of occupations at work here. The medical profession in Israel has seen over the last 20 years massive influx of Palestinian citizens as doctors, as nurses, as pharmacists, to the point that in some places, especially in the north of the country, they are the dominant group in the population. So that changes some dynamics. If you are a Jewish person, Jewish citizen, who has any contact with the health system, and most people do at some point in their life, especially now, but in general, that's the case. You are inevitably not confronting, facing, interacting, getting used to Palestinian Arabs who help you, who are educated, who are professional, who are considered to be good in their specific tasks, and they form a substantial part. By substantial part, I mean in some places it's like 30, 40% of the medical staff at various levels, not just the nurses, the doctors as well, the heads of departments, especially in the north, not everywhere. That's kind of a positive interaction that has been highlighted as a result of COVID, to some extent, but it's a permanent feature of Israeli life. And I think in the long run, it's important because it shows you an image of a Palestinian and Arab that is totally different from what you are used to. It's not this wild-eyed terrorist running in the street trying to kill you. It's a person who saves your life. It's not a one-off thing that will change your perspective, but it's important. When I grew up, there was nothing like that. I don't think I saw when I was in the 60s, in the 70s, even in the 80s, a single Palestinian citizen who played this kind of role. In my time, now it's the daily experience of millions of Israelis. So that's a long-term process, but it's important. Second thing is sport. Again, it's easy to exaggerate. I don't want to exaggerate. Sport is sport. It's not a central political issue. But in Israeli football team, there are always Palestinian players, now more than ever. In the national team, sometimes half of the team on the field consists of Palestinians. Recently, they played against Scotland. Of course, sports is also an area where you have tribal emotions that are easily inflamed and racist abuse, but it's also important. And just yesterday, I'm sure you know about it, or many people heard about this, the most racist football team in Israeli history, Beitar Jerusalem, that at some point changed the name to Beitar, Trump Jerusalem to show appreciation for Donald Trump, that its fan used to scream death to the Arabs at every opportunity, is now half owned by an Arab from the Emirates, not a local Arab, of course. Now, I don't want to, the agreement between Israel and the Arab Emirates and Bahrain, it's a separate issue. I don't want to glorify it by any means. But the fact that the most racist team is now an Arab owner, an Arab and Muslim owner, the team that refused to accept Muslim players from Chechnya, who of course had nothing to do with Arab or Palestinian identity, but they were Muslims. They rejected them. They were forced to, I don't know if you saw this documentary, Forever Pure. It was shown 3 years ago, I think, in film festivals in South Africa as well. I saw it in Cape Town, actually, about that football team. They are now owned by a Palestinian, sorry, not a Palestinian, but an Arab businessman from the United Arab Emirates. These kind of changes occur. This presence of Palestinians in positions in the sports field, in the medical field, are real. They are not going to change people's mind overnight, but they do provide some kind of counter dynamics to the dynamics that you are talking about, which are also real. I'm not denying them in the slightest. So we need to look at it in more dynamic, behind the scene kind of way. And one last sort of anecdotal evidence, but I'm originally from Haifa. And Haifa is, among all the Israeli cities, the most integrated. It still has a lot, a long way to go, but relatively speaking, it's desegregated, liberal, and so on. Whenever I visit my family there, I walk quite a lot. I love to walk there. And I see areas that when 30, 40 years ago were exclusively Jewish. Now they are populated by two groups in particular, local Palestinians, and Russian immigrants. So these Russian immigrants may be right-wing, in general political terms. They vote for Avigdor Lieberman, maybe on Likud in the elections, but they live in the same buildings, in the same streets. They shop in the same places as their Palestinian neighbors. And so again, this is a change on the ground. It's not reflected in grand politics. It's the politics of everyday life. How these politics of everyday life can be transformed into big picture politics, I don't have an answer for that. It's obviously not going to be an easy or an immediate or an obvious process, but it does give some rise to optimism in the longer term.
Yes. Professor Ran Greenstein, from the sociologist from the University of Witwatersrand, thank you very much for joining Africa for Palestine today. Really grateful for your presence and for your wonderful insights. And above all, for the fact that not only your mind, but your heart has been on the right place, as we say. Or shall we say on the left place?
Okay, I'll go along with that. Thanks very much for hosting me, and thanks, Farid, for your incredible input and helping the discussion proceed along this line.
Thanks, Ran, and bye to our viewers. Take care. Goodbye.
Bye.
Switch off, Ran.
Okay.